Thank you so much. So this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about how African countries raise more taxes. I'm going to start from why should you focus on taxation. I think it was clear from Andrew's introduction. It was also clear to me as I was preparing this presentation that you don't need to be convinced that tax is important. So I'll go very quickly through that. Then I'm going to focus a bit more time on, sorry, this is going ahead without, okay. I'm going to focus on how much more revenue is it actually feasible to raise, and then the bulk of the presentation is going to be on how to do that. So I usually start from the why, asking people, what is the most important thing to do in development? And then, of course, participants come up with, social protection, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure. And then I go on to say, well, none of that is going to happen if you don't have tax revenue. Now, I don't need to do that in this group because I know that in any conversation you have with your governments, with your prime ministers, presidents, whatever ambitious development agenda they might have, tax is at the core of it, because without it, none of it will be possible. So I want to show you one chart, which is always very striking to me. And it is a chart titled From the Aid Era to the Tax Era. I'm not sure if you've seen it before. It shows the past 3 decades of data. The red line is the non-resource tax revenue to GDP ratio. The blue line is aid, overseas development assistance to GDP. And what it shows you is that up to the 90s, and of course in the years before that as well, which are outside of this chart, what you had was a situation in which aid was the primary source of development financing. The blue line, aid, was above the red line, tax. It is around the year 2000, and especially from the mid-2000s, that tax has overcome aid as the primary source of development financing, and that gap has been widening. So the red line has gone, which is tax, has gone farther and farther away from the blue line, aid. So the other thing that you can notice from this graph is not only that tax is a much larger source of revenue than aid, but also it's very stable. So aid has some years in which it goes up and down. Tax might increase slowly, but it has increased over the years. But it does remain, it is quite reliable, and it doesn't look volatile. It isn't volatile. Now, tax is the main source of development finance. Andrew has said it very clearly as he opened up. I just want to go very quickly through the other bits of development finance just to make sure we're all on the same page, because the alternatives are there, but they're not really adequate. So aid, I'm going to come back to this point, will remain essential in the immediate future. But as you all know, I'm sure, is not increasing at a sufficient pace. There was this number a few years ago that rich countries had committed to, the 0.7 target for aid as a percentage of GDP. It remains a mirage. There's really very, very few cases of countries that have reached that target. Many of the main funders have abandoned it altogether. At the same time, aid is increasingly concentrated away from domestic issues in lower income countries. There is a large and increasing portion of aid that tackles issues like, for example, refugees in rich countries, but also that goes into middle or higher income countries rather than the lower income countries where poverty and development needs are more acute. So not only the pie is smaller, the slice that is going to lower income countries is also smaller. And that slice coming through in low-income countries, and especially the bit of it that goes through the budget, so budget support particularly, comes with influence and conditions. Now, I'm not telling you anything that is new, but I just wanted to put that in context. And likewise for debt, Andrew said at the beginning that, of course, debt is high and increasing. Debt service costs are also increasing very quickly, to the extent that the average low-income country today spends more in debt service than social protection or healthcare. And in fact, quite a few lower income countries spend more in debt service than social protection, healthcare, and education combined. all of us here are economists, so we do like to see net financial flows. And in the conversations that I have about debt, there is often an argument, well, net financial flows are still positive, so maybe debt service isn't such a big deal. But actually, net financial flows are turning negative. 1 in 5 low-income countries has negative financial flows, and that's projected to increase to 1 in 3. So it is a serious issue, and neither aid or debt can really be seen as major sources of financing, at least in terms of their increased contribution to development financing. And other options are discussed, but they're not really adequate. So tax remains the main source of development finance, and there's no way around it, to the extent that there isn't really a development agenda without revenue mobilization. So having gone very quickly through that, how much is needed? So it's obvious that more tax is needed, but how much more? So this is a chart that you will also have probably seen before. If you haven't, the striking bit that emerges from here is that lower income countries raise about 14% of their GDPs in tax. That compares to 38% in higher income countries. What it means is that lower income countries work on less than half the budget of high income countries. In many cases, they work on a third of the budget of high income countries. And that is as a percentage of GDP. If you're looking at the absolute numbers, the budget lower income countries work with is a tiny fraction of the budget of their counterparts. Yet, arguably, lower income countries is where there are the biggest needs, because infrastructure and services don't only need to be maintained, but they also need to be massively expanded. Basic services, infrastructure, both physical and digital, needs to be expanded in those contexts at the same time as resources are severely constrained. So although tax is the major source of development funding, it is also not enough yet. That creates huge pressure for governments to raise revenue quickly. So you will be at the center of that, and you will have discussed it several times, I'm sure, with your presidents and prime ministers. In this debate, there are several numbers flying around. One is the 15% tax ratio, which is seen as the minimum for a functioning government. This number also came up in the Elements paper of the Financing for Development conference coming up in 2025, which was just released a few days ago. There is an IMF paper showing that to make substantial progress towards the SDGs, so not fully achieving, but making substantial progress in a subset, in fact, of SDGs, lower income countries should double their tax revenue. That means another 15 percentage points increase in revenue, in addition to the average 14% that they're already collecting. And then finally, there's potentially overly ambitious, but certainly ambitious targets on how much more revenue is feasible. And a recent paper, for example, has done a sophisticated analysis that concluded that a staggering 9 percentage point increase in the tax to GDP ratio is indeed feasible in lower income countries. Now, I'm including those numbers in the slide just to give you a bit of a scale of the challenge. But what we did with my colleagues at the International Center for Tax and Development, we did a step back. We took a step back and we asked, okay, so this is how much it's needed. It's massive. But how much more can lower income countries actually realistically raise? And to do that, we have done something quite simple. So we haven't done any sophisticated econometrics. We simply went back to the data and we looked at what history tells us. So these two graphs, the one on the left, shows you all low-income countries, the blue line, and lower middle-income countries, the red line. And what the line shows is the average year-on-year change in the tax to GDP ratio. So the graph on the left is all countries, the graph on the right is top performers in revenue mobilization. What these pictures show is that on average, top performers in revenue mobilization raise 0.2 of a percentage point on a year-to-year basis. And this is top performers. History shows that sustaining a 0.5 percentage point increase in revenue, as in tax to GDP ratio, a percentage point of the tax to GDP ratio, is already extraordinarily ambitious. Most of the countries for which we have data, which is pretty much all of the countries, Of all of those countries, very few even increases of 5 percentage points over the 3 decades that we are looking at. And oftentimes when they achieved increases of 5 percentage points or more, it is after a conflict or in relation to the discovery of natural resources. And even when they happen, those increases that are large, but still 5 percentage points should be considered a very large increase, they are not linear and they happen over long periods of time. So the key messages from this part about how much is, of course, revenue mobilization is urgent and the required increase is very, very large. There is huge pressure to increase revenue. It is very present in any decision maker's mind, especially in low-income countries. But governments should prioritize reform that doesn't just raise revenue, but also does it in an equitable and sustainable way. And as Andrew said, and I'm going to come back to that point later, there is a real risk that resistance from citizens in particular will hamper any longer-term effort to revenue mobilization if reform isn't consciously and very intentionally equitable to start with. Such reforms is harder to do, it takes time, and requires careful sequencing. I will give you some specific examples on how that reform could look like. But before I do that, I just want to say one more thing, that as governments work on the revenue mobilization agenda, what the figures have just shown you imply is that in the meantime, while revenue is being increased, because the process will be slow, aid and debt relief and other sources of finance will remain essential. So it's not just because the revenue mobilization agenda is progressing that we can forget about the need for aid and debt relief. All of those sources of revenue are needed at the same time because progress on tax mobilization will be slow, as it should be, and as history shows us it typically is. So how can that happen? How can governments mobilize more revenue? I will show you 2 examples. One is about digitization in tax administration, and the second is about taxing the wealthy. Now, I chose those 2 examples because we have quite a lot of research, so I can show you examples on those 2. But there are many more that we could be discussing, including eliminating tax expenditures, which make up, in many cases, up to 5 percentage points of GDP in several countries, reducing opportunities for international tax avoidance, improving tax administration, reducing compliance costs, and so on. I'm only focusing on these 2 for now, but I'm very happy to keep the conversation open if there's interest. And finally, I will end with a word of caution about politics and the broader fiscal picture, coming back to the point that Andrew already mentioned in the introduction. So let's start from digitization. And I'm hoping colleagues in the room will tell me if I'm speaking too fast for interpreters, please. Please do ask me to slow down if that's needed. So I want to start talking about digitization by acknowledging the huge progress that has happened over the past decade in tax administration. Most revenue administrations now have digitized administrative data, which means data from declarations, payments, the taxpayer registry, and so on. I started working with this data in 2014, about 10 years ago. And when I started collaborating with the Rwanda Revenue Authority, using their administrative data for policy analysis and evaluation, no other country on the African continent had collaborated with independent researchers to do that. Nobody had shared their administrative data yet. Today, there are several countries and there's a wealth of research using this data. Now, why is that important? Because up to 10 years ago, the evidence that was available, at least the evidence that was publicly available for president and prime ministers to take decisions, was not evidence coming from the African continent. The evidence on what works in tax administration was coming from Germany, from the US. But we know that what works in Germany doesn't necessarily work in Uganda. So that availability of administrative data has transformed the evidence-based, and now governments can take their decisions based on their own data from their own context. That has been transformational already. Most countries also have integrated data systems. So ITAS, for example, is the integrated tax administration system that bring all data together in one friendly interface. There's also new technologies like electronic fiscal devices and e-invoicing that have significantly boosted enforcement capacity. Now, what does that mean in practice? Electronic fiscal devices are simply cash registries in the shops. I'm sure we've all seen them. What they do is they don't only issue a receipt, they transmit data in real time to the tax administration. So this means that the tax administration in real time can monitor transactions and every single sale from any business who uses the machine. And I'm going to show you what that did, that specific case of electronic fiscal devices to revenue. So this comes from Ethiopia. The only reason I'm using the example of Ethiopia is that it comes from my own work, so I know this case very well, but there are several other cases from other countries that show exactly the same result. In Ethiopia, a few years ago, the Revenue Administration adopted electronic fiscal devices and encouraged all businesses to adopt them. Eventually, they became compulsory. This adoption of electronic fiscal devices was paired with scaled up enforcement efforts. Now, what does that mean? In practice, it means that not only the tax administration had all the data coming from the devices, but also it was so much easier to check compliance because officials could go into a shop and ask, do you have the device? And it was very easy to check if the business had it or not. If they didn't have it, then they would be non-compliant and they would be required to adopt one. And that was so much easier than going through complicated audits and going through the business records. Now, of course, audits are still needed, but in that case, just the act of having the device was quite significant. Now, I'm sure all of us have experiences of going into shops and restaurants where the electronic fiscal device is there, but it is not really used. What this study shows is just having it in the presence, in the premises, even if it is not used all the time, led to a massive increase in compliance. VAT revenue increased by 48%, and there were spillover effects in income tax, which also increased by 12%. And again, this is not an Ethiopia-specific story. This is a story that has been replicated in many other countries. And it is only about the one technology. It is about electronic fiscal devices. There's e-payments, e-filing, and so on. And they all show consistently the evidence from African countries using African data from tax administrations shows that there are large revenue gains to be made there. Now, I wanted to give you an optimistic picture, but I also don't want to give an overly optimistic picture. So here's a few challenges that are still persisting. First, the quality of the data digitized in tax administration, coming through devices and so on, often remains low. Taxpayer registries are one example. They still contain vast numbers of taxpayers that are not really contributing at all and shouldn't really be there. So there's still lots of efforts to be made into improving the quality of existing data so that it can be exploited at best for effective analysis of policy and tax administration measures. Data is often not fully integrated with core administrative functions. So the data is available, but it's not necessarily used. This is an issue that I'm going to come back to. Just the fact that the electronic fiscal devices send the data and that there is a huge data set with millions of transactions digitized doesn't mean that that data will be used and doesn't mean that the revenue will be collected. It does require integration with administrative functions such as basic checks, audits, the risk function, and so on. And then finally, taxpayers respond strategically. So that is what we have also observed in the case of Ethiopia. So the revenue administration, the government, starts monitoring sales more effectively with electronic fiscal devices. What taxpayers will do, they will increase sales because they know they're more visible. They will also increase costs so that the net impact on revenue is there, but is not quite as large as it could be if the government could monitor all margins. So it is a job that is never done because there are multiple margins and taxpayers will move along the margins that are less visible. And that is definitely something that is observed and there is evidence for. So that is, to a certain extent, electronic fiscal devices are old news in many African countries. They are part of an early crop of technologies, including ITAS, fiscal devices, e-filing, e-payments, and so on. These have been around for a few years. This field is moving quickly. The next frontier is probably linked to what is sometimes called digital public infrastructure. It has three pillars, digital ID systems that have quite a lot of potential to improve taxpayer registration in particular, digital payments, that not only allow for payments to be done digitally to the tax administration, but also for the tax administration to monitor payments across firms and have another data point to check compliance. And then data exchange systems. That's the third pillar of digital public infrastructure. Data exchange is about government institutions. So think the revenue administration with the central bank, but also the revenue administration with commercial banks, or the revenue administration from Ghana with the revenue administration from the UK to check if Ghanaian nationals are paying what they should be paying in country. There is evidence on especially digital ID, digital payments. There is very few on data exchange, but the evidence is promising. I'm not showing you, we have done a few studies on those things. I'm not showing you, I had a slide, then I realized I wouldn't have time, so I have dropped it. But the story would be the same. There is huge potential. We're starting to see that potential realize, but there's also challenges related to how the data is used, how the data is analyzed, the complementarity between data and technology and traditional functions, and so on. As well as, especially for digital payments, adoption and trust, that citizens trust to adopt digital payments when they know that that makes them more visible. So all of these are barriers. None of them can't be overcome, but they are certainly the next frontier for governments to work on. The benefits are huge, from reduced administrative costs, reduced reporting and compliance costs for firms. So probably as advisors to presidents and prime ministers, you might also talk a lot with businesses. And at least what I hear when I speak with businesses is, yes, taxes are always high, but also they're complicated to handle. And digitization can offer a good way of reducing compliance costs, making it easier for firms to manage their tax affairs. It can also reduce the scope for corruption and collusion. The moment when data is transparently available within the tax administration so that multiple officers can actually check any taxpayer's record, it's a lot harder for any one tax official to enter into a collusive relationship with the taxpayer that relies on that interpersonal interaction. And we know that increased transparency and accountability helps revenue mobilization. So ultimately, all of it, reduced compliance costs, a more efficient tax administration, less corruption, more transparency, they all improve revenue and performance. I want to add a note on the human factor, because again, it's not just enough for digitization to progress on its own. Interactions between tax officials and taxpayers remain prevalent in lower income countries more than in higher income countries. The typical firm in a low income country will meet in person with a tax official at least a couple of times a year. And staff capacity is low. So although those interactions are more common, there are about 10 times as many taxpayers per tax official in a low-income country compared to higher-income countries. So tax officials in low-income countries are incredibly busy. They cannot quite devote the same attention to taxpayers as their higher-income counterparts because they have so much less capacity to do that. So at the same time as technology and digitization advances, it is essential to keep in mind that tax administration remains interpersonal, that staff capacity needs to be adequate, and that it is definitely a case of complementing digitized data with human capacity and potentially redeploying capacity of the existing staff away from manual tasks and trivial tasks towards higher return activities. So the key message here is that digitization has definitely transformative potential. We're already seeing increases in revenue. It's not only for tax administration. We know that innovation in tax administration has a history of spilling over across government. So data exchange, for example, stemming from requests from the tax administration might lead into improved digitization efforts, even in other bodies of government. That said, the potential is huge, but it is not a silver bullet. If digitization improvements go on their own platform, without really paying attention to investments in analytical and traditional enforcement capacity, the benefits of digitization will hit a hard ceiling. Because one thing is having the digitized data available, another thing is using it. And yet another thing is translating that analysis into actual collected revenue. So all of those things need to progress in parallel. the digitization, analytic capacity, and traditional enforcement capacity. And I've so far used the word transformative in a positive sense, associated with better tax administration, more revenue, but transformation can be scary for tax officials and for taxpayers. It is not unheard of that tax officials themselves resist to change, because change actually means that they have fewer opportunities for... Sorry, I'm pausing because I don't see my presentation anymore. I don't know if you are still seeing it.
Yeah, we can still see it.
We can, yes.
Okay, great, excellent. Digitization and digital transformation means that opportunities for example, rent extraction will be decreased, and government officers can oftentimes resist that change, and equally taxpayers can resist that change when they're excluded from digital governments that they are not able to interact with, or when digitization actually increases their compliance costs instead of decreasing them. So this is just a call for caution that change management is important for any of those benefits to actually be realized in practice. Okay, I'm going to move to the second example, after which I'll close quickly. I'm going to check how... Okay, I still have a few minutes, so I should be able to get there within 10 minutes at most. My second example is about taxing the wealthy more effectively. The debate on taxing the wealthy is incredibly lively globally. I'm sure you will have all followed the new studies and declarations coming out. When it comes to low-income countries, it's striking how little evidence there is. So much of the debate that we're seeing globally is not necessarily relevant to low-income countries. So we're trying to chime in here with my colleagues from the ICTD and figure out what is feasible in low-income countries. And in that context, there are two views that I'm calling the pessimistic and the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that informality and low incomes pose severe limits on the ability of governments to raise revenue from the wealthy. There aren't enough wealthy people. The informal sectors are just too large, and it's just too difficult to do that. So the best way to go about it is simply to forget about taxing the wealthy right now, focus on general measures to tackle informality and boost economic development, and more economic development will bring in more revenue. So that is a very simplified version of that view. The optimistic view is that bold progressive policy reform is indeed possible, and it is in fact desirable, and it is desirable to do that now. And that includes taxes on wealth. So we've heard a lot about the wealth tax in various contexts, and it also includes increasing top marginal rates on high income earners. And in this view, politics is the main constraint, but there's no doubt that it is desirable to have an ambitious reform. Now, what we're saying is that actually in lower income countries, there is a middle ground, and that middle ground is a lot more promising than any of the other views that are prevailing elsewhere. The middle ground is this. We think increasing taxes on the wealthy is indeed possible and desirable, and in that sense, we agree with the optimistic view. But that doesn't need to involve the introduction of new taxes or changing rates. It can actually be done with existing policy tools by strengthening administrative systems around them. What I think is that doing that is actually urgent and essential for any development effort. So unlike the pessimistic view, I don't think it's possible to do anything that will produce economic development without having the revenue to back it up, which is where I started from. Existing data and evidence supports the middle ground view. What this graph shows is three tax types. The darker bar is PIT, personal income taxes. The middle one is corporate income tax. And the lighter gray one is property tax. This is a ratio of ratios. So it is the tax to GDP ratio for each one of those specific taxes in low-income countries, in high-income countries, and low-income countries compared. So the way you read this chart is for the black bar, for example, high-income countries collect 3 times more revenue in personal income tax compared to their low-income counterparts, and that is as a share of their GDP. Like before, if we were looking at those ratios, in absolute numbers, it would be a much starker difference. But still, it's 3 times more collected as a share of GDP in personal income taxes and 6 times more taxes, property tax collected in high-income countries compared to low-income countries. Now, if you look at the CIT bar, which is the middle one, it's around 1, meaning that the tax to GDP, the CIT to GDP ratio in high and low-income countries is about the same. And this graph doesn't include VAT, but if you had a bar for VAT, it would also be around 1. So high and low-income countries are collecting about the same percentage of their GDPs in CIT and VAT, but personal income taxes and property taxes are largely underperforming. Now, by personal income tax, I don't so much mean taxes on employment. These are withheld by the employer. There's very little scope to evade there. I'm thinking about taxes on capital gains, investment income, rental income, and so on. Those taxes are underperforming not because the legal frameworks aren't in place. In fact, our research shows that the legal frameworks are there, the rates are all right, and the way the tax is designed is not actually deviating much from international standards on how to design this kind of taxes. The problem is they're poorly enforced, if they are enforced at all. So there is a gap, and it's not a gap that is there because the legal framework isn't there or because it's impossible to enforce these taxes. There is definitely room for improvement. So can countries include revenue from the wealthy using those tax levies in particular? The answer is yes, definitely they can. And in fact, they have already done that. So contrary to, I think, what comes up often in this kind of debates where, taxing the wealthy is so difficult in lower income countries, it can't be done. Actually, many countries have experimented with various measures to tax the wealthy more effectively, which has produced already large revenue gains in many occasions. The high net worth individual unit in Uganda has raised 5 million extra revenue in the first 9 months. A new system of property tax in Freetown, Sierra Leone has tripled the amount of revenue in the first year of its operation. And in Borno State, Nigeria, a new withholding tax on rental income yielded 1 million of extra revenue in the first year of its operation. And all of those numbers, I don't know if they sound large or small to you. I mean, I think it depends on how you look at them, but they're definitely just the beginning. These are definitely just piecemeal efforts, and you can already see the revenue generation coming through. You need to add to that the new and emerging field of exchange of information, which is projected to increase revenue in Africa by 5 to 19%. I don't know if those figures are overly optimistic, but definitely there is a massive potential there. So it is possible to make more of those taxes on personal incomes and property, and countries are already experimenting with it. What are the key elements of success of those cases? First of all, none of those efforts was a punitive mission against the wealthy. Enforcement was always combined with sensitization and improved transparency. In the case of Uganda's high net worth individuals unit, the approach was one of sensitizing wealthy taxpayers. There was a lot of discretion involved. And when officials working in the high net worth individuals unit realized that many of the wealthy were actually either in politics or very closely connected with politicians, they have established a VIP unit so that those taxpayers could be treated with discretion rather than going openly into a confrontation. And that proved to be quite successful. It has been hard to sustain, but it has been quite successful, especially as there was lots of political backing at the beginning of this effort. In the case of Freetown, most of the revenue, of the extra revenue coming from the property tax reform, came from the biggest properties. And the new way of calculating taxes was much more transparent, and it was much clearer to everyone because every taxpayer, property taxpayer in the city, received a clear communication about how the tax calculation is done and where revenue comes from. And there is evidence that taxpayers in general respond very well to increased progressivity with greater compliance, meaning that if you're able to convince your government to tax the wealthy more effectively, which doesn't mean introducing a wealth tax or changing your tax rates, it means enforcing the taxes that already exist. If you're able to convince your governments to do that, not only you have more revenue, you'll have a more equitable tax system, and quite likely you're going to have much more willingness across citizens more generally to actually contribute to tax collection. Citizens respond well when they see that particularly the ones with the greater means in society are actually contributing, whereas it's really hard to convince the ordinary citizen to comply when they know that not everybody is pulling their weight. The second element of success is to acknowledge quite explicitly that administrative capacity isn't there. Therefore, you can't establish a high net worth individual unit by adding more capacity. Maybe you will be able to convince your governments to inject more revenue into the tax administration itself, but oftentimes that isn't possible. But that means that you need to redeploy capacity to those high return activities, of which taxing the wealthy is the most promising one. And that is exactly what happened in those cases. Administrative capacity was redirected towards those underperforming taxes, property or personal income taxes of various kinds, away from other things. Now, a very promising thing to move away from is tax in the informal sector. Perhaps this is something that we can discuss a little bit more in the discussion part. Now there is mounting evidence that registering thousands and thousands of small taxpayers and trying to bring them into the tax net is really not very helpful for revenue generation. There is very little revenue to be made there. So the extra revenue is close to zero. It is not good for equity, and it creates a large administrative cost for a tax administration that is already incredibly constrained. So it is really not a good idea, and we can discuss that a little bit more later if you're interested. The other thing is the example I gave you before, digitization. By moving away from some more trivial tasks, that capacity can be upskilled, developed, and redeployed towards higher return activities. Now, of course, I also, like before, I don't want to give you an overly optimistic picture. There are several obstacles, technical, legal, political, administrative. Not only they're of different kinds, they're all interconnected with one another. So successful reform requires a clear understanding of those obstacles. It requires a clear understanding in context, and successful strategies have been able to tackle multiple potential barriers at once. So establishing a high net worth individuals unit is an administrative change. It needs to be backed up by the technical capacity to connect data across institutions of government. It needs to be backed up by political leadership, so that when there is resistance from wealthy taxpayers, the political leaders are backing up the tax administration in proceeding and pressing on with their efforts. Leadership is essential especially for taxing the wealthy at all levels, political, technical, not only within tax administration, but in so many other government institutions, ministries of finance, parliamentarians, and so on. There are several strategies to improve taxation on the wealthy. I have showed you a couple. There's definitely more. One of the promising ones is voluntary disclosure programs, which are often coupled with data sharing. So what has happened in many high-income countries is that in advance of massive efforts to share data internationally across jurisdictions, taxpayers have been told, we are about to share data with other jurisdictions, come to us and avoid fines if you don't want us to get to you. And in fact, the vast majority of revenue generated from things like automatic exchange of information comes from voluntary disclosure schemes, because taxpayers do come forward when there is a credible threat that the data will become available and the revenue authority will get them anyway. So there is definitely lots of promise there. Lower income countries and countries in Africa aren't there yet because there is a huge investment to be made at the beginning to even be able to access those opportunities for data exchange. And we can discuss that a little bit more in the discussion part if that's of interest. But those are all strategies that are feasible, and many of them are already happening. And many countries, including on the African continent, are already preparing for it. And that is before you start thinking about general wealth taxes. So I personally think general wealth taxes are not a bad idea, but I don't think it would be good advice for African countries now, because a general wealth tax can only be successful if it is backed up by strong data and administrative systems. And I think there is a lot more that needs to be done to strengthen the administration and enforcement of taxes that already exist in your tax systems. Because I'm sure all of the taxes that I mentioned, capital gains, investment income, rental, property, they already are there in your country's tax codes. So starting from strengthening those, using that as a basis for a wealth tax, if and when that will become politically feasible and desirable. So the key messages here are that increasing revenue is definitely possible and desirable. It can be done within existing policy frameworks. Sensitization, transparency, and equity are essential in those efforts. And yes, of course, political constraints are real, but they might not be impossible to overcome, especially now that the pressure to increase revenue is just so high. A final note of caution, and I'll be wrapping up. I'm an economist. I understand most people in the room are economists. We have a tendency, or at least I certainly have a tendency, to see tax reform as a technical challenge. I want to think, what are the constraints to tax reform? How do I design a tax reform so that it is effective in raising revenue and also equitable? That is my own bias. And definitely you can have a very technical approach, particularly to digitization, but also to taxing the wealthy. But tax reform is never only technical. It's always deeply political. And ignoring politics and the broader fiscal picture comes with huge perils. And this is where Andrew started us off at the beginning of this webinar. This is what we researchers like to refer to as the fiscal social contract, which is often presented as a virtuous cycle. So citizens pay tax. Because they pay tax, they request accountability. The government provides services in a way that is accountable so that those services are of greater quality as citizens engage more in that bargaining. Now, the problem is that we are in a vicious cycle right now in many countries, where services are simply not enough, they're not of good enough quality, the revenue isn't there to improve them, and citizens resist to actually providing that revenue, which leads to the scenes that we've seen in many countries, from Ghana to Kenya to Uganda to Tanzania. Citizens are just not ready to pay more taxes because they don't see services in return, and they don't see improved standards of living coming back from their tax payments. And that is even made worse by the fact that a lot of the revenue goes out the country in debt service. So with that, I'll conclude. I hope I gave you a bit of a cautiously optimistic picture that yes, mobilizing more revenue is essential. The increase that is required is massive, but it is possible. And in fact, there are ways to increase both revenue and improve equity at the same time. It does take time, and it does require a little bit of patience and quite a bit of political capital, probably. I had also included some questions for you, but for now, I'll just thank you for your attention, and I'll pass back to you, Andrew. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Giulia. That was, I mean, it covered only 2 ways to raise taxes, and yet it was comprehensive enough that, in fact, there's a lot to talk about and think about. So let me open it up for questions. I know that Adam have already